Hey folks, you'll probably recognize right away that this is a different kind of presentation. This week, I want you to read a pretty advanced level review published in the Annual Review of Psychology. It's Developmental Adaptation to Stress, an Evolutionary Perspective. This was written in about 2018, published in 2019, and connects with a lot of the topics we're discussing throughout the class. So this is not a lecture about the topics in the paper. I want you to read the paper. This is instead kind of a presentation giving you a model of how I think you should be reading the paper. What is the best way to go through, read, and understand a review from a prominent psychology scientific journal? So I'm just going to take you through the process that I go through. I will explain some of the background concepts and the theories you need to know, make connections to other parts in class, but that's the secondary goal of this presentation. The primary goal is giving you some background of how I would recommend reading this article. The first thing I'm going to do when I read a new article that somebody suggests to me, like a colleague or a professor, is try to connect it with what I already know from psychology. In this case, it's pretty clear to me that this article is going to be talking about stress. So I'm thinking to myself, what do I know about stress from like my social psychology courses? I know that stress is adaptive. Social psychologists talk about it like it's a good thing. Stress is an indication to your body that it needs to solve some problem. And humans are designed to be in pretty stressful environments. But I also remember that stress can be a bad thing. Particularly, the thing that stands out most from the classes I took is that stress can be a bad thing when it's prolonged stress over long periods of time that your body doesn't get to rest from experiencing that stress. The next thing I'm going to think about, because of the title of the article, is I'm wondering what levels of analysis did we use when discussing stress? So the levels of analysis approach, to remind you, is thinking about the same topic from different perspectives that are all true at the same time. Now, they use the word developmental in there. So I think about, well, we could talk about stress as an individual phenomenon, an interpersonal phenomenon. We could talk about stress, like how it originates in the brain, what it does to the body. But a level of analysis that we don't usually do in a social psych course is talk about the developmental view of stress. So how it impacts someone's development. So I'm just going to keep that in the back of my mind for now. I might want to update what I think about stress with this developmental view. It doesn't contradict the individual and interpersonal stuff I already know. The next connection I'm going to make after looking at the title, skimming through the abstract, is that these authors are going to bring up evolutionary psychology. What do I need to remember about evolutionary psychology before reading this article? Well, I know that evolutionary psychologists make hypotheses based on the ancestral environment that humans lived in and how that has shaped our brains over evolutionary history. But we don't have access to time travel, so we can't actually go back in time and look at humans before they were humans, or tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were humans but lived in completely different cultures than we live now. So how do we make evolutionary hypotheses if we don't have access to time travel? Well, I remember from discussions in class that evolutionary psychologists make testable hypotheses based on their predictions of what the ancestral environment might have done to our brains over time. They can still test these predictions even if we don't have access to brains from 100 or 200,000 years ago, and find evidence for or against their hypotheses. So it's possible to test these things using an evolutionary psychology lens, but maybe you remember your instructor saying that good evolutionary psychology is not just evolutionary psychology. It's making connections among lots of different disciplines. So I'm going to be wondering going into this, are these authors going to back up their evolutionary psychology hypotheses with good evidence from other places in psychology? Now, obviously, I assigned this to you, so you know my opinion is they did do that. The next thing I'm going to try to remind myself of is that I do know quite a bit about how evolutionary psychologists think. For example, I've read that classic paper from Cosmides and Tooby in 1997, and they lay out some principles of evolutionary psychology. Now, even I don't have them memorized, so I went back and found the PDF I downloaded and just reviewed for a second those 5 principles of evolutionary psychology from that paper, just in case they're going to be relevant for reading a new paper in evolutionary psychology. While I was thinking about Cosmides and Tooby, I remembered that different psychologists will analyze the same problem from different levels of analysis. Now, they presented in one of their classic papers, when you're thinking about things from an evolutionary perspective, think about how a behavior solves a problem at the adaptive level. So what are you doing to solve a problem? The cognitive level, what is going on in your brain, your cognitions, your thinking when you're addressing a problem, and the neurophysiological basis of that behavior. So when you're addressing a problem, how is your body responding to that? The endocrine system, the nervous system, and so on and so forth. And so they split any single behavior into those 3 levels of analysis that are all active at the same time. So obviously with stress, the neurophysiological basis of stress, we learned a little bit about that in my social psych courses. Your body releases stress hormones, for example. Cognitive, okay, when you're stressed, it changes the way you think about the world. I know that. And what is the adaptive problem that our responses to stress are there for? Well, I remember that if something's stressing you out and it makes, your body responds by getting rid of that stress, that's good, makes you more healthy. Okay, that's great. Now, I know that different psychologists use different levels of analysis. Sometimes different approaches are more appropriate. Levels of analysis isn't a specific set of steps. It's just recognizing that you can look at the same problem from different angles. Now, this isn't what I would typically use, but I'm going to add a developmental level of analysis here because that's obviously what the authors are trying to get me to think of. So I don't typically use that when I'm thinking about problems, but I'm going to add that in to my levels of analysis thought process while I'm reading this article. I think I'm about ready to start actually reading the article now. Now, this is actually another difficult decision point because if I've not read a lot of psychology articles or scientific articles, where should I start? So here's where I'm going to give you my advice and tell you the process that I use. So we're going to skip the step where we select an article because somebody provided this article to you. What's the first thing that you should do when you get a new scientific article? Skip all the information in it. Just read the abstract. So I'm going to read the abstract of this article before I do anything else. Just remember, the abstract is a short summary that is supposed to include everything in the article, all summarized. It's found at the very beginning of a PDF. It's found at the very top of a web page if you're on the publisher's website. So I'm going to read that abstract. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to be thinking about what kind of article is this. Because I know that scientific journals publish several different things. Sometimes they'll publish opinion pieces. Sometimes they'll publish empirical articles. Empirical articles are where scientists actually collected data. They did an experiment, for example. But that's not all that gets published in there. So I need to determine what kind of scientific publication this is. Now, there's a couple places you can look for this, but the title of the journal gave it away for this one. Annual Review of Psychology primarily publishes reviews. In this case, reading the abstract makes it very clear this is a literature review. This is not an empirical study. They didn't collect new data. Now, I'm sure they did, but not for this paper, okay? They published this paper, which is a literature review leading to they are proposing their unique theoretical perspective on this issue. They're probably doing other work and publishing it in more appropriate places where they're actually testing their ideas. But for now, this is a review. That means that if I go looking and really trying to find the experiment that they did, I'm not going to find it. If I try to see what their sample was, who their population was, I'm not going to find it. None of that's included. It's a lit review. All right. So the next thing is, how should I read this article? What should I do? I looked at the title. I looked at the abstract. I know what kind of article it is. What am I going to do next? Well, this is me telling you my real process for this. I know that reading a scientific article is hard work. Even for me, who does it all the time for my job, it's still hard work. So to make it as easy as possible for myself, first thing I'm going to do is go back and look at the abstract, see if they've got a table of contents. Sometimes a review will have that. From the abstract and table of contents, I'm going to either by hand or on a computer make a list for myself of what are the major topics that they're going to go over, what are the questions they're asking, the topics they're reviewing, and hopefully they will list pretty clearly for me what they are trying to contribute to the literature, right? A good literature review will often end with, I've done all this reading and research. I have a perspective on this issue about how all this stuff relates together. I'm going to share that with you. So hopefully the authors made that clear. If they did, I'm going to add that to my notes so that I know what to look for. So I actually started that process. I made kind of a list. Fortunately, the PDF included a table of contents. So between the abstract and the table of contents, I kind of know what the authors are going to tell me about. So first of all, they've got an introduction where they're going to talk a lot about stress. I know a lot about stress. I don't have to be a professional psychologist to know a lot about stress. I took a social psych class. But then they mentioned they're going to talk about plasticity, and they're going to do some review about studies about plasticity. They are going to introduce something called life history theory. That seems important. If I've not heard of that before, I want to make sure I know what that is, because it seems like they're going to tie that into lots of places in their paper. Next, they're going to review stuff including like theories about allostatic load. I have to look up every time what they mean by allostatic load. That is just the term they're using for your body is out of homeostasis when sources of stress are introduced. Your body then has to address that stress to try to get back to a balance point or homeostasis. Fancy terminology, but I know that when I'm stressed, I try to do things to reduce the stress. That's all it means. Now, maybe I don't know what the adaptive calibration model is, so I'm going to take a note of that. That's probably going to be important. Next, they tell me they're going to review diathesis stress approaches, so I'm going to take a note that I need to know what that is. They list some models of susceptibility. I don't know what all those models are. By the way, that is not me acting. I don't know every single model used by psychologists. So I really had to redo that section and make a note that I'm going to have to, at least write the definition down of these models. And finally, before their conclusions, they're going to talk about fragmentation in the literature, or maybe fragmentation is a specific theory. I don't know. I'm going to write that down so that by the time I get to the end of the article, the authors are going to give me a conclusion. I need to know all the vocabulary, all the theories that they're going to talk about when we all get to that conclusion together, so I know exactly what the heck I'm talking about. knowing whether I trust their conclusion or not. All right, for the next few slides, I'm just going to read this article together with you. I recommend that you pause, try to read some of the article, and then take notes on it to see if your notes somewhat match up with the things I'm noticing. Maybe I'll notice things that you don't because I know more about some areas of psychology. Maybe you'll notice things that I don't because everybody's got their own perspective. But I'm going to read their intro first. They start with talking about the fact that stress is bad, and if children are raised in stressful environments, it does bad things to them. Okay, that doesn't seem to be anything groundbreaking, so I'm going to move on. Where I get surprised is where they bring up the perspective that stress may prompt the development of costly but potentially adaptive strategies. So they're saying that stress can make people do good things. They make it really clear that when they use the word adaptive in their article, they're using it in the same sense that biologists, especially evolutionary biologists, are using the word adaptive. Adaptive means that a behavior leads to better like genetic fitness over time. It doesn't mean that it's like necessarily good behavior. All right, that's a good distinction to keep in mind. They promise to tell me more about their evolutionary developmental perspective. They give me a preview of some of the things they're going to do at first. So they're going to tell me more about life history theory. All right, I need to know what that is. Mechanisms of plasticity. All right, I'm getting a sense that I need to look up what plasticity means. I did a quick search on what that means in the literature, and when they talk about plasticity, they're talking about something that psychology students know very well. Plasticity just means that when your body goes through certain events, you change. So your behavior is plastic, meaning it's changeable. You change your behavior to fit your environment. So maybe what they're saying is if you go through stressful events, your brain is going to change a little bit so that you are better able to handle the types of stressful events that you're going through. Okay, that makes sense when I think about it. They promise to tell me more about the adaptive calibration model and how it's different than traditional models of allostatic load. All right, I don't get that yet, but they're promising to tell me more. I really picked up on the fact that they kind of directly mentioned that they're going to analyze in their paper using Lewin's equation. They didn't say the name, but I recognize that they talked about the fact that our response to stress is a person by environment interaction. So they're going to talk about individual or personal variables and environment variables, just like we do in a basic social psych class. So I feel pretty confident I can get that. I'm going to move on past the introduction. All right, getting further into this, it's becoming a little bit more difficult to read, but I understand in their Beyond Dysregulation section, I think what the title of the section refers to is that dysregulation theories of stress say that stress leads to dysregulation, end of story. Meaning that stress is bad, it makes you do bad things, we're going to stop talking about it. But the authors are saying that is an oversimplification. Instead, they're pointing out that in nature, animals don't have one optimal strategy. All organisms, not just animals, not even just plants and animals, but all organisms change a little bit or a lot in response to their environment. And so saying that stress always is bad is an oversimplification. Instead, you should think about it as like stress leads to an organism changing its behavior, which yes can be bad, but also might lead it to do better in the future. And that makes sense because if you are a plant, oh my gosh, I need to go water my plant. I just realized. If you're a plant in my apartment that I keep forgetting to water day after day, maybe you change the way you regulate your energy so that you use less energy, like you're expecting less water, so you adapt to a harsher environment. I'm going to go in between these slides and water the plant. All right, so it makes sense that all organisms adapt to change, when things get stressful, maybe you adapt to it. And yeah, it can be bad, but it could also help you. They actually give some examples of what they call developmental plasticity, which is when an organism is going through a harsh environment when it's very young, when it's still developing. So it changes its behavior, and that actually might help it in the long run. They give a really interesting example about how this happens in tadpoles. So if tadpoles of a certain frog species are being hunted by a predator, maybe they adapt by changing their shape so that they end up being smaller, which is bad for a lot of reasons, but helps them survive the predator. That's interesting, but does this happen in humans? The authors give a lot of different citations pointing out changes in humans, like adult behavior, based on things that happen to us in childhood. I'm convinced that, so all these studies, I skimmed a couple of them, which is overkill for you, but it's what I'm doing. These studies all looked really good, but the authors are still making like a connection between them that the original authors oftentimes didn't make. So I'm still going along for the ride. I'm not convinced just yet, but we're still pretty early in the paper that all these different studies all show the same pattern, which is humans responding to stress by changing our behavior in a way that is adaptive. It makes sense so far to me. That's what developmental plasticity is all about. I think that humans definitely have that. I just don't know if they have it the exact way the authors are describing. Now, one of the ways that they talk about how being subject to stress can change an organism for the better, they talk about how biologists use life history theory to think about these issues. And I do happen to know a little bit about life history theory. So I kind of see what they're getting at. If you want to read their explanation here, they give a really simplified explanation of life history theory. The Wikipedia article on this is also pretty good. It's enough to understand what it's about. I'll give a short explanation here. So biologists have noticed for a long time now that different organisms obviously reproduce at different rates. And what works for some organisms, slow reproduction or fast reproduction, doesn't work for other organisms. So elephants reproduce at a much slower rate than most other animals, and it works for them because elephants reproduce really slowly, but they work to provide for their offspring so that their offspring are guaranteed to be successful because elephants are pretty cooperative compared to other animal species. So yeah, they don't have many offspring. I think that their gestation period is over a year, but it works for them. Salmon are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where instead of having one offspring every year, salmon they lay thousands of eggs, they fertilize thousands of eggs, and most of those eggs don't end up being successful new salmon. So it's kind of, they have many offspring, but a lot of them are going to die as part of just the natural life cycle of salmon. In evolutionary terms, salmon are also successful. Yes, many of their offspring die, but also many survive. So what life history theory is looking at is across the animal kingdom and also across other organisms, we see these two very different patterns of reproduction, very slow, very fast. Humans are closer to elephants because, it takes 9 months before a human baby is born. And then arguably, we're the slowest reproducing animal of all because not only does it take 9 months for a baby to be born in humans, but then that offspring is kind of weak and defenseless for many years after it's born. So it takes a lot of resources to raise a human child so that it can be, alive on its own. Anyway, this is well known. There's no debate about this. The authors also point out that yes, there's some animals that reproduce slow, some are fast. Everything falls along this spectrum. But within the same species, there may be some environmental factors that push certain organisms to reproduce faster or slower. Um, I don't think this is mentioned in the article, but I'm familiar with one species because I'm from Tennessee, and there are coyotes in Tennessee. Growing up, it was a policy of a lot of people I knew that if you saw coyotes, they're dangerous for livestock and they should be hunted. But I'm aware now that coyotes have differences in the species between a slow and fast reproductive strategy. What this means is that when they are living comfortably and they're not being hunted and they have plenty of access to food, coyotes tend to have fewer pups. They have just a few pups. They take care of them really intensely to make sure that they survive and grow up and can reproduce themselves. But when coyotes are in an environment where there's lots of danger, there's not a lot of food, they're being hunted, some of them are being killed, we see that they have more pups. So what is causing that behavior change? Well, it appears to be when they are being hunted, when they're being persecuted, they have more pups because they're going for a faster life history strategy. We're going to have more offspring because we can't guarantee that any one of our offspring is going to survive. So it can actually lead to this effect where organizing a coyote hunt in an area can lead to more coyotes next year because they have more pups. They're adapting a faster life history strategy. Okay, that makes sense. We have kind of a lot of accumulation of evidence that um, between two species, you can be faster or slower at reproducing. Within a species, we have lots of evidence that some species tend to reproduce faster or slower under certain environmental conditions. Now, does this connect with humans? I'm going to let you read the evidence yourself before, making that decision. For now, let's move on to the next section. So now that we've read about life history theory, we know that life history theory isn't about stress in particular. It's just a theory that helps biologists and now psychologists to explain certain patterns that we see. They get into the real meat of their argument in the beyond allostatic load section. So first of all, I liked their quote, allostatic load is a term used to describe the wear and tear that results from repeated allostatic adjustments. Okay, that's just a vocabulary word to describe what we go over in a social psych class, which is that when your body responds to stress, it costs your body some resources. This is why long-term exposure to stress leads to heart health issues, circulatory system issues, I should say. It leads to immune system issues and lots of other things that we've talked about, right? Now, that's the perspective that is found in most textbooks. That's the perspective that I teach in like my intro class for sure, is that long-term stress leads to what they call maladaptive and toxic responses. Short-term stress can be good, but long-term stress is bad. Now, what they're saying is that that is an oversimplification. They are presenting their adaptive calibration model. That's been in the literature. They have some citations if we want to read more about it. They're saying that that applies to how we think about stress. According to the adaptive calibration model, stress pathways that we know about from class, like the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis that I teach about. They act as advanced systems that modify our behavior. Well, okay, that makes sense. You've got systems in your body, in your brain, that modify your behavior in response to stress. But these authors are pointing out that if we think about it in terms of life history theory, we see certain patterns emerge, like the vigilant pattern or the unemotional pattern. So the vigilant pattern emerges when, while you are a human developing over time, you are exposed to a lot of sources of stress in your environment. So you become really vigilant. You're on the lookout for threats. That makes sense. If you are exposed to a lot of threatening situations throughout childhood, you begin to start looking out for threatening situations. That could be a way to protect yourself. But if you're exposed to not many threatening situations, your HPA axis and other stress systems in your body puts you into an unemotional pattern where you're not really on the lookout constantly for new threats, because looking out for new threats is itself a stressful process. Your body's on alert. So if there's not many threatening things around, your body being on alert doesn't help you. So you fit into the unemotional pattern. And I really think that this connects well to our discussion of the immune system in a social psych course, because we talk about how a long-term exposure to stress without periods of rest is bad for your immune system functioning, because your body is using up all those resources, not really recovering those resources. And so one of the parts of your body that suffers is your immune system. It doesn't have the resources to kind of build back up your immune response. And the authors are providing a lit review, giving all these different pieces of evidence to support their viewpoint that your body has these adaptive calibration systems. And what we know, we've talked about before, is that your body responds in certain ways to stress. The new perspective these authors are adding is that what I presented as a bad thing, being constantly vigilant about sources of stress from your environment, can actually serve a purpose. Yes, your immune system might not function as well, but if you live in a threatening environment and are constantly on the lookout for threats, that could actually help you. And that makes a lot of sense. So I'm starting to understand their perspective here. I'm going to keep reading. Okay, for this next section, they talk about the diathesis stress model that many people use, and they're asking about whether that might be an oversimplification. Again, diathesis stress is something I use to understand vulnerability to certain disorders. What that means is it's a way to think about how vulnerable different people are to a certain disorder. Um, Everyone has an individual level of like your individual vulnerability, and then you have the environment giving you stress. So different people under the same stressful conditions, one person might develop a disorder because they are more vulnerable to it, another person would not. I have a history of diabetes in my family. My mom has type 1 diabetes. Several older family members have had type 2 diabetes. So we are we have genes that make us a little bit more vulnerable to type 2 diabetes, but the environment helps determine whether that vulnerability is exploited or not. So we might develop diabetes where another person doesn't, exposed to the same environment. According to the authors, they're tying this into developmental plasticity and saying that our different vulnerabilities to certain conditions are a cost of humans having developmental plasticity. So developmental plasticity is good, but just because it's good on average doesn't mean it's good for every single situation. Okay, that makes sense. They're also saying that plasticity is affected by a gene and environment interaction. That makes sense. But what is this term differential susceptibility that they are introducing? Well, that is similar to the diathesis stress approach. Differential susceptibility says that different individuals have a different level of plasticity. So our behavior, our body's responses Not everyone has the same flexibility of your body's responses. So your genes and things that have happened to you during your life might modify how plastic your body's responses are. And that kind of makes sense to me. I don't know much from like the textbooks I use, the classes I teach, that directly contradicts that idea, but I do need to see some evidence from the authors. Fortunately, in the sections I have listed here on this slide, they do provide a lot of different references, different studies that fit into their pattern, that fit into the hypothesis that they have about this. What kind of evidence are they providing? They do show some studies that indicate that children raised in supportive environments have more adaptability, more plasticity to changes later in life than children raised in more stressful environments, so with a higher allostatic load, to use their terminology, indicating that the environment that you're raised in could make you be able to be more or less adaptive. They also show some studies where we're looking at like genetic differences and find that there are some genes that may be linked to higher adaptability, higher plasticity than other genes. I'm not going to go over all the evidence. We can read the article ourselves, but they provide a lot of evidence that supports this viewpoint. Now, I'm going to take a step back and talk again like as a research methods instructor and say with a review like this, it's important to recognize that the authors could intentionally or unintentionally, unconsciously, only be offering us citations and evidence that support their viewpoint, but they're either not aware of or they've chosen to leave out studies that the evidence does not support their viewpoint. So it's possible that that happens here. We'd have to see what other scientists, other specialists in this area say about this. But at this point, just from this article, they have provided a lot of evidence that supports their view that different individuals have different susceptibility to environmental pressures, stress, other sources of allostatic load. All right, we're finally at the point where I understand what they're talking about with beyond fragmentation. They're saying that different scientists have all been studying this same issue with a lot of different perspectives, fragmented perspectives, and they're saying we should bring all these fragments together, put them together, put all these puzzle pieces together, and they're all part of the same picture. So the central question addressed in this review is whether childhood exposure to adversity simply constrains development, as assumed in dysregulation models, or guides that development in an adaptive manner. All right, I kind of understand where they're coming from now. They provided quite a bit of theoretical evidence and all these different studies that indicate that yes, people are more adaptive than the traditional viewpoint gives people credit for, that some of these principles used by biologists that apply to other species could also apply to humans. They've made some connections there, but at this point, I really do want to see a specific set of research that is specifically about humans. I am not really fully convinced that their perspective applies to humans. And this is where the authors introduce a case study about the timing of puberty. So I'm not going to go over all the evidence here because we all have the paper and the citations, but to kind of summarize what I took away from it, they are presenting the perspective that they're presenting facts, okay? And then they're making assumptions about how the theory applies to those facts. So it is a fact that humans, like other great apes, go through puberty, and that there is a wide variation in when humans go through puberty. So we know this. Puberty is affected by a lot of different factors like nutrition, and we know, based on studies, that puberty can also be affected by other sources of stress like malnutrition, but also um, physiological stress. Traumatic childhoods can impact when someone goes through puberty. Abuse impacts when someone goes through puberty. So there's lots of psychological, physical, nutritional, physiological, all different factors that lead into puberty happening faster or slower. Now, what the authors are presenting is that there's a pattern here. And the pattern of puberty being faster or slower on its onset um, fits their theoretical perspective that faster and slower puberty onset times both have an adaptive value under certain conditions. So here we're connecting a real human behavior that we know there's variation with their theoretical perspective of why that variation exists. So what they're saying is that later onset of puberty fits more with the life history strategy of a slower reproductive cycle. Faster onset of puberty, earlier in your lifespan, fits more with an organism having a faster life history strategy with faster reproduction. All right, maybe I can see how that applies to other organisms. Does it apply to humans? Well, just because puberty is happening earlier or later, going back to evolutionary psychology, we have those adaptations. That doesn't mean it's going to directly affect how early we have kids or how many kids we have in a modern environment. So maybe these adaptations are real adaptations that we have still from our ancestral environment that don't affect modern humans. So let's just look at the evidence, right? Does it fit their pattern of stressful environments lead to earlier onset of puberty? And they do provide a lot of evidence that that is the case. But as they point out, early puberty is not necessarily purely adaptive in the modern environment. And in fact, it has drawbacks as well. Going through puberty earlier, this goes back to their differential susceptibility perspective. Going through puberty earlier might be adaptive from an evolutionary perspective, but it costs the body. There are some physiological changes, there are some problems that are more commonly seen in individuals who go through puberty at an earlier age. So they've made the connection here. They've made the connection here that there is at least one case study of a specific pattern of human behavior that fits their model of stress changing how we develop. All right, that's interesting. Am I convinced? Am I convinced by this one example that there are different responses to a stressful environment? Some are more adaptive than others, and we can make hypotheses about this that give us more information. Here's where I'm going to do the disappointing thing by not telling you, my clear opinion and asking you to make up your own opinion about this issue. This is a very interesting theory. I like this paper. I like this perspective. I think that their viewpoint that humans' response to stress is oversimplified in many resources has some value. They do provide a lot of positive evidence in support of their perspective that stress causes developmental changes that might be adaptive in humans and other species. There's a trade-off to these adaptations, but that on average, in evolutionary terms, this trade-off is worth it in terms of reproductive success. They have applied, so speaking of evolutionary psychology, they presented a theory that doesn't require us to get in a time machine, that we can test their theory using modern humans in contemporary samples to see if it fits with their expectations. And although they did not collect original data for this review, they presented us with a lot of evidence accumulated from other psychology studies that gives us information about whether their theory is likely to be correct or not, because it fits the evidence or not. I appreciate the process they went through. I think there's a lot of good stuff here. Without giving you my final opinion, I want you to make your own opinion. I think there's a lot of good stuff here about reanalyzing past data using modern perspectives. So psychology as a field is always changing. Does this mean that the research that happened a decade ago, 20 or 30 years ago, is incorrect? Should we start over again? No, I think we have to recognize that this is how science works. We accumulate data and evidence. The new generation of scientists is better informed about how certain things work, so they come up with better, more accurate theories. That leads to better, more informed hypotheses. And we get closer and closer to the truth every generation. It would be boring if we got to the truth and then got to stop as a discipline. No more psychologists. We know everything there is to know about human behavior. Anyway, that's just my general take on this article, how I would go about reading this article, how I would go about organizing my thoughts. What I would end with is I would write out my takeaway conclusion about what are the important things I got from this article. Do I think that their perspective is true? What evidence do I have? It's not like it's a yes or no question. It's a, is there evidence for their perspective, weak, medium, or strong, right? That would be my summary. All right. Hopefully after this video, you probably read the paper before you watch this video. If not, go back and read it, get your own thoughts organized, and what do you think?